For the first 10 or 15 minutes of my presentation today, I'm going to be more or less reading from the text I have here, because what I'm presenting is I'm developing an argument in this lecture. The first lecture was like a narrative of the development of the ideas preceding Vygotsky. The one the other day was just a presentation of a series of concepts from Marx. And this time I want to develop an argument, and to do that I use a number of quotes. So it's necessary for me, I can't just improvise when I'm trying to quote somebody. So you'll forgive me for the first 10 or 15 minutes. I'll spend a lot of time with my eyes on the paper, which is not my natural way of delivering, but I think the only possible way. Now, Vygotsky came to psychology from aesthetics. He was interested in literary criticism, art, film, and the various contested theories of aesthetics. This is a very unusual road to psychology, especially in a time when behaviourism and Pavlov were the dominant forces in psychology. People mostly came from medicine to psychology, or biology. But Vygotsky came from aesthetics. But he went into a psychology, where I mean a group of people, a department and an institute of psychology, where the majority were reflexologists. There were also supporters of Wundt, who were subjective psychologists, but they were, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, they were really under pressure on the way out. The dominant trend was reflexology. So in 1924, Vygotsky turned up at the Second Congress of Neuropsychology and gave this speech. And you have to imagine, I'll be reading excerpts as he develops his argument in the speech. The guy's never been seen before, he's quite young, he's only 20-something. He's in a hall full of eminent, people who are known to this day as contributors to that kind of psychology. Eminent psychologists, and you will see he challenges them directly. He speaks in the language of reflexology. He uses the vocabulary and concepts of Pavlov and so on. And he says, consciousness is only the reflex of reflexes. If the claim that consciousness too has to be understood as a reaction of the organism to its own reactions, one has to be a bigger reflexologist than Pavlov himself. So be it. So the conventional wisdom among Vygotsky scholars is this was a speech during Vygotsky's reflexologist stage, and then later he had a reactologist stage, and Vygotsky's life was explained, his professional development, by going through a series of stages. Now, when you hear what he's got to say about reflexology, despite the fact that he consistently uses the language and concept of reflexology, and you take into account that this is a guy who's just come from formalism versus symbolism and phenomenology and this kind of thing, you have to, my assessment is that he's not a reflexologist. He begins by declaring that the methods of reflexological investigation of man have now reached a turning point, explaining that outside the domain of the elementary and primitive, reflexology was left only with the general bare claim, equally well applicable to all forms of behaviour, that they constitute systems of conditional reflexes. Okay. Continuing this damning characterisation of the poverty of reflexological research, Vygotsky claimed that if reflexology was to become a general science of behaviour, then its methods would have to merge with those of its opponent, subjective psychology, whose methods hinged on dialogue with the experimental subject. I understand the political context of this in the Soviet Union of 1924 that tell what was taken for granted to be the Marxist line in psychology, then had to merge this method what was taken for granted to be the ideological opponent, the idealist line. Okay? So this is a pretty front-on challenge. He develops from here a really stunning and beautiful line of immanent critique. That is to say, where he uses the ideas of reflexology and develops them to a point where he completely negates reflexology. I'll do this. He quotes an eminent reflexologist to the fact that one should use for experimentation the most sensitive reflex. Yeah? And he points out, after all, isn't the speech reflex the most sensitive reflex? Therefore, experimental work on psychology should focus on the speech reflex, that is to say, talking to people. The reflexologists held that self-observation, that is to say, asking subjects about their own state of mind, is an inherently unscientific method of investigating consciousness because it was subjective. But Vygotsky points out that an experimental subject's responses to questions are simply experimental data to be subject to scientific analysis like everything else that takes place within an experimental setup. According to reflexology, thought was a speech reflex which had been inhibited before it became manifest. You know, like you're speaking to yourself, but you don't actually utter it. Right? So you're going to speak, but there's an inhibition against actually voicing, and that's called thought. This was their theory. Right? So he said, why is it allowed to study complete speech reflexes, but forbidden to take account of these same reflexes when they're inhibited? If manifest reflexes are objective, that's to say speaking, then inhibited reflexes, that is to say thoughts, are also objective. It's only a question of the methods to be applied to study thought. Now, if you follow this, he's proved, using the concepts of this most banal, vulgar materialism, that thought is objective. Okay? The only question is how to study it. Vygotsky goes on to talk about the capacity of the reflex to be a stimulus for a new reflex. The mechanism of awareness is the mechanism of transmission of reflexes from one system to another. And this allows them to make a reflexological, I've never heard this word actually said before, so I'm stumbling, I've read it lots of times, but reflexological definition of consciousness. The act of thought, the act of consciousness, is in our opinion not a reflex, that is, it cannot be also a stimulus, but is the transmission mechanism between systems of reflexes. And this is an idea which is making sort of a bridge for it. The definition avoids both reductionism and allows Vygotsky to ask rhetorically, is a scientific explanation of human behaviour possible without the mind? In fact, even the most extreme reflexologists such as Pavlov and Bechterev accepted that consciousness exists and that it forms an essential component of human behaviour. One could say, how could you deny it? But you know that people do. They simply refused to admit the study of thought into an objective science on the basis of the unsustainable claim that the study of thought is possible only by self-observation or introspection, which is by definition unscientific. So this locks them into an inflexible dualism in which reflexology is only able to make the most banal and empty claims, while psychology, such as Wundtian psychology, subjective psychology, is unscientific. So one is completely empty and useless, like scientific. On the other side, it's full of insights and evidence, but it's unscientific, so don't mix it up. Banal but scientific, rich but unscientific. So they're trapped. Vygotsky concludes with the following. Psychology has to state and solve the problem of consciousness by saying that it is the interaction, the reflection, the mutual stimulation of various systems of reflex. It is what is transmitted in the form of a stimulus to other systems and elicits a response in them. Consciousness is a response apparatus. Consciousness is the reflex of reflexes. To study the behaviour of man without mind, as reflexology wishes to do, is as impossible as to study mind without behaviour. Okay. So, that's an immanent critique. An immanent critique is the method that Vygotsky learnt from Marx, who in turn learned it from Hegel, and it's a method whereby you can appropriate the wisdom from another thinker, another science, right? By following its own arguments through to the end. Now, the claim that Vygotsky has just made, it makes sense of it this way, as consciousness as a system that's mediating between two systems of reflexes. More specifically, we can say consciousness is mediating between physiology and behaviour. In the sense, the outcome of the interaction between physiology and behaviour. Now, this claim by the reflexologists and the subjective psychologists that the only way that you can observe consciousness is through introspection is completely mistaken. In fact, you cannot observe consciousness by means of introspection, and it can only be reconstructed from observation, just the same as a geologist or a historian or a physicist reconstructs the subject matter of their science by reconstructing the facts from observation. The same is true of the mind. One has to develop the particular techniques whereby one can deduce what's behind the observation. Right? But mind is no different than the subject matter of any other science. It has to be reconstructed from observation. Now, what's his name? Noam Chomsky expresses very well when he said is physics to be the science of meter readings then. Right? Because that's all physicists do. They observe meters. But we accept that those meters, little dials and things, oscilloscopes, are designed to reflect some property in the world beyond the meter. And we use this meter and that meter and this kind of observation and that, and we look at it from this side, from that side, and we reconstruct and deduce what's there behind our immediate perception. Immediately we look at like an ammeter, and from that we know there's current of a certain extent going through. The mind is the same. We observe someone's behaviour, and from that we deduce what they're thinking. Right? That's a normal scientific method. Now, the final comment on, I was just talking about immanent critique. I imagine that no one in Vygotsky's audience understood what an immanent critique was, and that in the Soviet Union then and probably right up to the present day, science is political in the sense that one joins factions and supports a particular faction in science. So if someone's talking in reflexological language, one assumes he's a reflexologist. Right? And he becomes to creating solutions and it's all hopeless. Then he's just a crazy reflexologist. Right? But the method, the same as people think that Marx was a political economist, and he created a thing called Marxist economics. This is not so. He was engaged in an immanent critique of political economy. He was not a political economist. And Vygotsky was not a reflexologist. But amazingly enough, I'm in a tiny minority in saying that. Now, we need to have a closer look at behaviourism. I use the word behaviourism in a narrow, strict sense with all those varieties of the study of human behaviour that exclude consciousness as a category. I'll read you a paragraph from J.B. Watson. He had Russian and American behaviourism developed in parallel at the same time. But J.B. Watson, he's very clear. He expresses himself very well, and so we should turn to him for the definition of behaviourism. He says, psychology, as the behaviourist views it, is a purely objective experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behaviour. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent upon the readiness with which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness. The behaviourist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognises no dividing line between man and brute. Now, there's 4 points in what he says there. Firstly, the aim is to predict and control behaviour. I'll put it to you, overwhelmingly, the only people that are interested in predicting and controlling behaviour are capitalists, prison guards, marketers, got a few more down here, but to give you the interrogators, politicians and bureaucrats.
Teachers?
Teachers? No, no. Because a teacher that's here to learn about Vygotsky, their aim is to give to the pupil, he's not allowed to say pupil, he said learner, the learner, the capacity to emancipate themselves by getting control of their own behaviour. And one could claim that controlling oneself is, after all, a subcategory of controlling people, but the whole tendency and practice of behaviourism is contrary to it. It's for controlling and predicting the behaviour of other people. But it's not accidental that Vygotsky appropriates quite a lot from behaviour for the purpose of people gaining control or mastery of their own behaviour. Secondly, it excludes evidence proffered by the subject. So we here have a person that has a problem, has knowledge and everything, knows what they're feeling and everything, and what they have to offer is absolutely useless, ignored. Right? So there you have a clear relationship between the scientist and the subject. Anything the subject's got to contribute on the matter is worthless. Thirdly, it excludes any notion of consciousness. Right? So you've got here psychology without consciousness. What the hell that means, goodness knows. But of course, it remains, I mean, in the university I came from, you had a department of psychology and a department of behavioural science. Because, to their credit, the psychologists could not live with the idea that consciousness didn't exist. So they gave a different department, and the larger department carried on with the behavioural science, chasing rats up and down the wall and so on. Well, takes human beings and uncultured groups. Why not learn psychology from a rat? It hasn't got a consciousness, so what? We don't believe in consciousness anyway. Let's torture some rats and learn how they think, or how they behave, sorry. Okay, so that's behaviourism. Now, I've got another slide here. Yeah, there are two lines of development of behaviourism. One is the physiological behaviourism, the other social or sociological behaviourism. The physiological behaviourist seeks, through the study of the physiology of the nervous system, to learn something about consciousness. So you're looking at Pavlov as the greatest figure down that direction. Okay. The social behaviourists understand that you actually can't learn anything about consciousness with a scalpel and an MRI. Cannot. The way to learn about consciousness is the study of behaviour, and in that sense is obvious and clear agreement with Vygotsky. The only thing is, because they go along with the idea that you can't observe behaviour, so you can't observe consciousness, they still exclude consciousness as a scientific concept. And finally, just out of this comes to the most consistent advocate of behaviourism is B.F. Skinner, and he excludes consciousness and physiology and any concept like character or motivation from psychology altogether. He treats the human being as like a black box, input in, output out. And all you've got is a relationship between input and output. And to try and give names like character, strength of will, or education or learning to what's inside the black box that you regard as might be a shorthand for a particular relationship between input and output, but you still regard all those concepts basically as unscientific. Now, Vygotsky was very clear on this, but he doesn't cast behaviourism aside, because he recognises that observation of behaviour is still the foundation for the study of consciousness. Okay? But he also shows that self-observation, introspection, is rightly excluded from science. So this is another tick he gives to behaviourism. Now, I just want to spend a minute on explaining why self-observation cannot be a scientific method of accessing or observing one's own consciousness. So I'm just going to take a slight detour back to the question of the ontology of consciousness in order to bring this out. The other day when we talked about Descartes, we looked at the important dichotomy or difference between my consciousness and what lies outside of it. That there's no sort of shade between them. I'm talking here on my own behalf, so to speak. It's important for me to know that my opinion about the world, or my knowledge of it, or my view of it, is categorically different from the way the world is. Now, that doesn't negate the fact that somebody else's thinking, somebody else's consciousness, is part of the material world beyond my consciousness, and I must understand somebody else's behaviour as a product and reaction of their environment, specifically the interaction between their own behaviour and their physiology. There is no good saying about myself that what I'm thinking is something to do with the interaction between my behaviour and my physiology, because what I think stands or falls on its truth or falsity. The explanation of that, like, you have this thing to do with studying criminality. Oh, this young boy, I know he killed that woman, but look, he came from a hard family, we shouldn't blame him. You see, that's always problematic, isn't it? Because yes, you understand why someone's mind got to a certain state. But on the other hand, if you're going to treat them as a human being who takes moral responsibility for what they do, that's not enough. Okay? So this is the dichotomy that is at work here. My ideas have to be taken as something distinct from the material world, but in order to understand how other people are thinking, methods of science apply. Understanding that consciousness arises through the interaction of physiology and behaviour, through perfectly objective, natural processes. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is sometimes difficult, although probably both statements make sense to you, hopefully. Putting it together can be a bit difficult, because people tend to take things as, yes or no. Look, is consciousness something objective, or is it something subjective? And give me a straight answer on this. Is consciousness categorically and radically different from the objective world, or is it a material process? And the fact is that of all concepts in the world, you can't deal with consciousness like that. My consciousness is that through which I see everything I see, including other people's consciousness. The distinction between that presentation to me and the thing which is being presented is absolutely fundamental. And if one denies a complete and radical difference between that, you've got to be insane, really. I just haven't explained myself. You cannot possibly believe in the identity between a thought and the thing thought of. But when observing behaviour, you have to accept that someone else's behaviour, or if you're observing my behaviour, then you'll analyse it not only according to the correctness or falsity of what I say, but the background I've had, what I've read, and so on. You'll treat it as, in a scientific way, is the interaction between physiology and behaviour. Yeah? You okay on that? So the dichotomy is just an ontological distinction. The reason for making that point is that it gets dropped and forgotten at some point. Yeah? And you start treating human beings, human subjects, with moral responsibility for what they do as just products of material processes. They are, but you can't treat a human being like that, and you can't treat yourself like that. I'm sorry, I'm driven by my anger, I'm going to punch you. It doesn't work, right? Explaining what I'm going to do by the material processes that lead to it. Okay. Now, this is Vygotsky's explanation. He says, I'm quoting here from the historical crisis of psychology, you know that word. The question is whether in introspection, phenomenon and being coincide. And quotes Lenin, the only property of matter connected with philosophical materialism is the property of being an objective reality, of existing outside of our consciousness. The concept of matter means nothing other than objective reality. existing independently of human consciousness. Okay, now I'll just unpack it, because I've already done some explanation of that. I'll go through this briefly. What does it mean when he says the question is whether in introspection phenomena and being coincide? Phenomena is appearance. Being is what is. So if one observes one's consciousness, you could say, isn't the appearance and what it is the same thing there? You follow that? Someone could claim that by looking at their own consciousness, they not only see an appearance, but they see what their consciousness is. Therefore, here's a case where one has direct access, contrary to any other science, direct access, unmediated, to the subject under discussion. Okay, but this is not true. Basically, when you turn your mind to look at yourself, the state of mind that you had before you reflected on what you do is a completely different state of mind. Right? It's like, I bet I'll do it several times before I'm finished talking about it. I'll trip over these cords, you know. When something disturbs you and you suddenly have to throw your attention back into what you're doing, that's a completely different state of mind. What you were doing before that is something else. Right? So what you get from introspection is a view of introspection. Take another angle on it. You might see some guy, about to leave a party, rolling from one side of the corridor to the other. You fit to drive? Yeah, I can drive. Yeah, I'm perfectly clear. There is a bell. Okay, that's his consciousness. But you know that he is misjudging his consciousness. He's drunk to the bell. You know? But he doesn't see that. Right? And you can also be a perfectly sober, sane person, and someone else will go, geez, he thinks a lot of himself, doesn't he? Up himself. Yeah? Whereas you're thinking, I'm being very humble and kind and polite here. Right? That it's just common everyday experience that people don't know themselves. I think I mentioned before, it took my entire life to realise I was not a technical person and should get a job somewhere else. Yeah? And everyone around me, my first 4 years of training at university was a civil engineer. Everyone else knew I wasn't an engineer. It took me 2 years to find that out and start thinking of a different career. And I'm sure other people were the same. So we've got introspection is not a scientific or valid way of observing consciousness. You have to, other people observing the person behaving can piece together a good picture of consciousness. Doesn't mean to say that consciousness doesn't exist, just because you have to piece it together from observation. The same is true as everything in the world. Every science that exists pieces together the object of its science by observations. Look at it from this side, look at it from that side, look at it from above, look at it with infrared, ultraviolet, and you piece together a picture of it. Okay? Now, I want to look at, Lenin mentions philosophical materialism. And Vygotsky on this question is in support of Lenin on this. So I think I've said often enough that the only claim of philosophical materialism is the distinction between my consciousness and the outside world. Can't really go anywhere else with it. What people who want to make a living as a professor in that discipline can do is just go around and show others and forget this from time to time. That's all you can get out of it. This is a quote from Marx. This is from the German ideology. He actually wrote this and crossed it out, which always leaves one hanging, but it's frequently quoted. It says, my relation to my environment is my consciousness. I think I've got this on a slide. Oh, I've gone for that. Right. Now, first thing to notice about this, Marx is talking in the first person singular. And that's not very common. Marx doesn't often talk about himself. Not very scientific, is it? Yeah? Second, my relation to my environment is a very broad category. Very broad. Right? It doesn't go on about conscious awareness or anything like that. So what consciousness means in this tradition, you see, Marx, Vygotsky, Yenko, that whole tradition, using the concepts in more or less the same way. So what consciousness means is the relationship to the environment. It's not some particular aspect or subcategory of consciousness. It's the whole thing. Yeah.
Can you define conscience? What is conscience?
Oh, I am. Consciousness is, well, I'll use Marx's definition. I'll give you a couple of others in there. It's my relation to my environment. Okay, let's go on to another one. This is Feuerbach, sorry?
Conscience.
Conscience. Oh, look, another day. It's a perfectly valid concept. I don't want to put it down, but it's not on the topic. Okay? This is Feuerbach. Ludwig Feuerbach is the founder, really, of philosophical materialism, as a critique of Hegel. Marx was a follower of Feuerbach for a year or so. He says, what for me is a mental, non-material, supersensory act is in itself a material sensory act. Now you won't find many instances where Marx and Feuerbach agree. Yeah? Marx, created his philosophy really by criticising Feuerbach. What's the next slide? Oh yeah, I get that in a second. Okay, so are we clear on this now? The fact that consciousness is one thing when you're talking about yourself. When you're talking about it in general in the world, you take a different attitude towards it. Okay? So that's why Descartes wasn't completely up the creek in insisting on dichotomy between my consciousness and the world outside. He went off the rails by trying to found a philosophy of epistemology, the sources of knowledge on that. That was a mistake. And it took at least 100 years for people to extricate themselves from that mistake. But the dichotomy is perfectly correct. Okay, can you see that okay? Okay, the little rabbit thing, I'm going to call it a toy. And we're going to use the metaphor of a mirror, which is an incomplete metaphor for consciousness, but it will serve to make this point even clearer, I hope. What we have here is a natural process, biology and things, or cell, it's a toy animal, natural process that produces this object, which is a toy. Over here, you have another natural process, optics, to do with reflective surfaces, beams of light, and so on, bouncing. So we have two natural processes there. One that's contained absolutely and entirely within the mirror, and another one which is contained out there in the world somewhere producing this toy. Now what we have here is an image alpha of the object A. Now how does that image arise? You take two objective processes, one which produces the toy, the other produces the optics, and the result is an image. Now, it's madness, isn't it? To say the image is in the same category of existence, same kind of thing as A. That toy, or the animal, whatever it is, will exist when you take the mirror away. It's there, independent in itself. It doesn't care about the reflection. It exists independently of the reflection. But that reflection doesn't exist independently of the material process over here producing this rabbit. Also, you know where the rabbit is, you know where the mirror is, but where is the image? Now, if you know anything about optics, it's quite clearly defined where the image is. It's called the virtual image, right? Because it has a virtual location. It's an equal and opposite distance from the mirror to the other side. And if you walk backwards and forwards, you can keep looking at it, and it seems to be in that place. But there's nothing there. Go and have a look, there's nothing there. And this is why these sort of neurobabblers, so you people with their MRI scans and electrodes on the head and dissecting brains and things, insist that all these psychologists up the creek, they've had a look, and consciousness doesn't exist. Like I said, they've looked in the brain, it's not in there. Right? So it's a completely different kind of existence, isn't it? It rests on material processes, those of the object being reflected, and that doing the reflection. But in itself, it's not real. It's an illusion. Now, if you try and make a reflection of that image, it doesn't work. You can do a double reflection of two mirrors, but it's still the reflection of the object, of the toy, eh? You can't, because that's not a light source. You can't make a reflection of that image. You can't touch it. You can't find out where it is. It doesn't exist. In the sense of natural science, it doesn't exist. Right? You can do all sorts of studies about where it is. The fact that it doesn't exist doesn't prevent actually scientific study of it. I think it was about year 9 physics. We play around with little mirrors and light beams and learn to find where the virtual image is located. It's really just science, but actually it's that kind of optics is a study of illusions. And in that sense, it wouldn't be true wrong to say that psychology is a study of illusions as well. Because in that sense, our psychology is just a more or less adequate reflection of our behaviour and experiences. People okay with, I mean, I've really hammered the point, haven't I? I've made the same point several times around. Do anyone want to challenge or disagree with anything here before I go on? Yeah.
I just want to clarify, in the world, all of us are working from our consciousness. In fact, all of us are working from a reflection.
Yeah.
All of us are working within what doesn't exist, but it's sort of, it's all we've got in it.
Yeah. In a sense, it's what does it mean to exist? Right? It doesn't exist in the sense of a material object. Right? Look, one of the other things, it is wrong to... Sorry?
That image is very clear.
Good.
The first time I really got it.
Yeah, it's good. You can't identify alpha with pi either. That's sort of what the neuro people do. They don't say, they can say, look, consciousness doesn't exist, you're deluded. You may think you're thinking, but you're not. Yeah? Because you've had a look inside your brain, you can see there's nothing going on there. But others say, yes, there's something going on. There's all this neurological activity. Little neurons connected to other neurons buzzing around. And so that's what thought is. I put this, scope on top of your head, and there's a lot of activity just under the skin there. That's you thinking so and so. And when you get excited and see something you like, it buzzes over there. Aha. So that's what that thought is. But I mean, that's nonsense, because one neuron is connected to another neuron, is connected to another neuron, or maybe you'll be connected to nerves and things in your body. But you never connect to anything outside your body. Yeah? If I'm looking at you, maybe, you're miles away from me, and I have a perfectly clear picture of you in my head. So I mean, in my head in inverted commas, right? No neuron theory of identifying an image with a neuron can explain that. The fact is that image is not in the mirror. Right? If it's anywhere at all, it's miles away from the mirror, but it's not anywhere. It's a phantom. Now, there's nothing wrong with the fact that we manage to live and develop and change the world and make inventions, get married, have all these things on the basis of illusions. Better or worse illusions. But by constantly checking things, say so-and-so was nice, oh no, he's a rascal, watch out for him. Oh right, okay, you improve your illusions, right? You make them closer to reality. I mean, there may be a sharp division between my consciousness and the world, but there's not a sharp division between reality and illusion. The world we live in it's an illusory thing, but we make it better and better and more adequate, and that way we live perfectly well. But if the scientist wants to find somewhere, I mean, these Nobel Prize-winning, world-famous people, like this Damasio, the last book I read of his is just around the corner from finding the executive function, or the executive centre, which is modern biological speak for the homunculus. He's going to find a little man that's directing all the things, watching the pictures on the screen and taking action accordingly. They still haven't got beyond that. Right? Because the method of natural science is based on the assumption that the object of their study is something existing in the world independently of them. And consciousness doesn't fit in that. It just doesn't. The object of my consciousness, the little green rabbit, exists outside my consciousness in the material world, but my idea is it doesn't. It's caused by the rabbit inclusive. You can't take a thought, it's caused only by neurological things, especially if you do Vygotsky. It's reflecting some real content in the world. Okay? So this is all philosophy, there's no psychology involved here. It's just plain logic. And I always feel I'm a bit of a fraud talking to psychologists, because you guys actually do work. You find out how kids learn and do real stuff. But the thing is that if you're not clear on these sort of simple logical things, things get confused. That's all. So it's good if I come along, speak to you for an hour, clear up the confusion, and you get on with the real work. Ian.
And let me play chair for a moment. How long do you think you've still got to go?
I made a mark in my book just here, but I'm 60% of the way through. And I'm changing topic now. So should I accelerate?
Well, then can I just indulge in the conversation for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
You see, one of the things that interests me, and I don't disagree with your basic account, but that image, alpha, has causal powers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which
Because it's mediating between your behaviour and your physiology.
Okay, but it means it's not just a phantom, as you put it.
That's a certain criterion for a phantom, which is okay, because the idea of phantoms is not real, it can't have any effect in the world. But I'm saying, look, that's actually untrue. Phantoms can scare people to death. Right?
So I want to say to you, it's real, it's not a phantom.
Yeah, it's a real illusion. A real illusion is because the whole capitalist world is based on a real illusion that money's got power. Yeah? Where did that come from? Yeah? It's an illusion, but it's a real one because everyone else believes it.
But is it, for instance, if you're looking at yourself in the mirror, does it bring you to the awareness or consciousness of yourself?
Yeah.
Or your image of that? Is that a state of being of in relationship to your power?
So I'm just getting every second word, and it's hard for me to respond.
Let's
I
imagine
think
this
God
is
is the
not
first
a
last.
Okay. Let's imagine this is me looking in the mirror,
Yeah.
seeing an image of myself,
Yeah.
bringing me to the consciousness of who I am
Yeah.
or what is happening
Yeah.
with my facial expression
Yeah.
or whatever at that point in time.
Yeah.
Is that an illusion or is that real?
Well, it is an illusion because you look at the reflection of yourself. What if the mirror was bent? You think, oh,
Will it
yeah,
affect my consciousness of who I am and my behavior?
yeah, what you're looking at is not you, as it happens. I mean, I can look at myself like that, but you're looking at a reflection. I mean, we're sort of mixing up a metaphor with what it's a metaphor for, you know, it's a bit complicated. It needs some time to dwell on. You will find, if you Google my name, you'll find the homepage, follow a couple of clicks and you can get the full text of this talk, not with the pretty pictures, but you can read it also again at your leisure. Because it is confusing. Every time I wake up, is that really true? You know, go through it again. It's confusing, right? So it may take a bit of going over. It's only logic. So I'm going to move on now, if that's okay. The next question is, by what means to study consciousness? Right? Okay, we've said we've got to a point where it has to rely on the observation of behaviour, but that's very general. Now, Vygotsky contrasted the behaviour of Pavlov, who exhaustively and empirically investigated one reflex in one animal, to the reflexologists who just asserted dogmatically that everything is a reflex. And Vygotsky really had Pavlov on a pedestal. He had an enormously high regard for it. His followers he had very little regard for. He says, what gives Pavlov the right to call his experiments the study of the higher nervous activity of animals? How was it that the fact that Pavlov's dogs salivated the signals given by Pavlov immediately became a general biological principle? And Vygotsky answers himself, this proved possible because Pavlov maximally abstracted the phenomena he studied from the specific conditions of particular phenomena. He brilliantly perceived the general in the particular. Whereas what the reflexologists have done, they've just taken the word as a name and applied the name reflex to everything. They have this absurd thing like speech reflex. And like at the time Mike Cole visited the Soviet Union, people like Luria, this great psychologist, had to do everything in terms of reflexes. It's utterly meaningless, because by applying it to everything, the words become meaningless. No help at all. To just give a name to a complex process, okay, if you give a specific name to it, then you've at least got something to call it by. You know, say, hey, look at this microphone. But if I call everything in the world a reflex, say, look at this reflex, hey, I've got another reflex, and it's useless. Right? I've got a diagram for that. Oops. Yeah. Okay. So this is a first clue for Vygotsky. I mean, he studied the methodology of all the great scientists at the time to try and work out his own methodology. He makes a great synthesis of the methodological gains of his contemporaries and predecessors. Now, he turns to Marx, and he actually says, our task is to make the dust capital of psychology. Now, this takes on a specific content. Because what Marx did after, from 43 to 67, 24 years, so I think he could probably cut it off about 1859, but still a long time working through trying to get a handle on political economy. And then he writes in the preface that the germ cell of bourgeois society is the commodity. And the first chapter begins with a description and analysis of the commodity, and for the following whole 3 volumes he unfolds the nature and behaviour of political economy in a society in which capital rules from that one concept of the commodity. Of course, the process of deduction is joined at every point with observation. But basically, a science is not a science unless you can deduce all the phenomena of that science deductively from a concept. Just listing, you can't say zoology is a list of all the animals. When Darwin came along, it was possible then to study animals and see, in terms of natural fitness, to give some kind of explanation, to link all animal species into some kind of logical order. Okay, so you had to do this for psychology. What was the unit of analysis instead of a commodity, right, or cell? Unit of analysis for studying psychology. Now, in doing this, I don't know if Vygotsky knew of the source of the idea in Goethe, but he was a great fan of Goethe. He quotes Goethe in his works more often than he quotes Hegel for a start. And his colleague Luria ultimately declared himself to be an advocate of romantic science, which is totally Goethe's science. So there's good reason to think that not only does the idea he used originate from Goethe, but he actually knew that. Now, Goethe didn't invent the word Gestalt. Gestalt's a very common German word, meaning form or shape, dynamic form or shape. But he gave it its specific meaning, whereby we recognise the word Gestalt in other languages apart from German. He also invented this word Urphänomen. Ur means original, prototype, typical, and phenomenon just means appearance. Okay? Now, the Urphänomen is the smallest single thing which is part of some larger phenomenon or complex process, and Urphänomen, the smallest single thing which contains all the essential properties of the whole process. And in fact, when you identify the Urphänomen, you create conceptually the process as a gestalt. So when you say, capitalism actually is just the development of commodity exchange, you realise everywhere where commodity exchange is going on, capitalism is at work. Right? So when people start talking about marriage contracts and outsourcing their garden or whatever, this is capitalism at work, transforming all relations into relations of exchange. Now, so Goethe invented this idea, and he invested a lot of time, and he didn't have any really great breakthroughs in this because, for one, the development of microscopy didn't get to a point where you could see the cells in the plant until shortly after he died, and then the cell was discovered, and away we go. Biology was set on its own footing, scientific footing. The little picture on the side is just an image to remember the idea of Gestalt, right? And the idea that the whole arises out of some little cell. Not necessarily all the same thing in common, but some basic elementary sort of molecular relationship generates the whole phenomenon. And that's what makes it a phenomenon and not a lot of phenomena or an arbitrary collection of things. The fact that they all arise out of one relation. Now, I think I'll go straight on to look at some of the similar concepts which need to be distinguished from what Vygotsky calls unit of analysis, what Hegel called concept, what Goethe called Urphänomen, and what Marx called the cell. Unit, and I'm using the word unit for that, which Vygotsky does as well. This concept as the smallest part where the particular, which contains the general in embryo, is called a unit. We also have the concept of an element, which I'll come to in a minute, a microcosm, an attribute, and an archetype. I don't think I'm going to get to archetype actually. Now, an element, by contrast to what I've just described for a unit, it's a smallest unit out of which the whole can be constructed. So for instance, you've got a big lump of water, you can say that it breaks down into hydrogen and oxygen. And hydrogen and oxygen are of course known as chemical elements. The elements which make up water are hydrogen and oxygen. But the thing is that neither hydrogen nor oxygen display any of the properties of water. It's only when you put two H's together with one O that you exhibit the properties of water. Same extent, an individual is not in a sense, it's an element of society. And our great politicians and advertising men and social theorists and sociology are happy with that. Societies are a collection of individuals. You've got a short individuals, you've got a short society. But the thing is that the essential properties of a human being, for that matter, but certainly any social group, are not manifested in an individual person. It's only when you get two people together that they can talk, and that they've got something to talk about, and they've got something to do with each other. Yeah? I mean, it's plain, it's not necessarily given logically, that if you want to understand society, an individual person is not going to do it. An individual person could push on their own, will wither, go mad first, and then die of starvation. That's because the unit, on the other hand, must be a self-sufficient organism. It must not only, in an abstract kind of way, have the properties of the whole, but it's got to be able to sustain itself and live, and function as a whole. And for that we know we need more than one person. So we contrast unit and element. Most traditional, like non-Vygotsky science, or non-Marxist science, are happy to go with an element. And it means they can never understand the process as a whole. Because what they have to do to understand the whole process is introduce new concepts that applies to the whole process. So you have society, social institutions, and political parties, and all sorts of concepts that apply only to large groups of people. But since you can't, since your elements are individual people, and an individual person can't be an institution or a political party or a state, sociology becomes a separate science that's completely disconnected from the nature of human beings that make it up. But that wasn't what Vygotsky wanted to do. His basic objective was to contribute to the creation of a social society and a new kind of human being. I mean, unfortunately, he wasn't totally in control of that project, and went a bit awry along the way. But that's what he was motivated by. So he understood people as part of a society, and his objective was much to reform the social life as the individual was part of it, because you couldn't do one without the other. Okay? Now what have we got? Microcosm. Microcosm is a word that's fairly widely known. Right? It seems also to be a simple unit in which the properties of the whole are reflected. So it seems to be very much like a unit. The difference is just this. A unit is the simplest, most elementary, embryonic, has nothing else other than the minimum properties required to constitute the whole. Whereas a microcosm really it exhibits all the properties in itself. And you might say that, well, for example, if Marx had wanted to start with a microcosm of capitalist society, then he wouldn't have started with a commodity, because exchange of commodities hardly ever actually happens in a modern capitalist society. You can start with a bank or a big capitalist enterprise and study it, and then through that microcosm that happens in that institution, you'd show all the properties that found in capitalist society's life. I mean, that's a reasonable project to do. It's a great literary project, but it wasn't a scientific project because you had already constituted before you the most developed form of it. So you're starting with the answer. If you want to explain a process like capitalist society, you have to start with the simplest, most basic. The unit, not the microcosm. The microcosms are, of course, fascinating things in themselves. Now, attribute. I've just got, what have we got there? Yeah. Okay. Most science, let's take, anyone know set theory? Anyone? Hand up, just want to know how many people know what set theory is. No, yeah, Ian does. Okay, yeah. Mathematics has a set, and it'll say, all members of set X have two heads or something. Right? And therefore, you gather together all the elements with two heads and draw a circle around, so there's the two-headed set. And marketers and political pundits really are completely into this. They go around asking people, are you for this or against this, or what is your favourite so-and-so? And they draw up maps and say, look, if you mention this word, then you'll get a good response, because I found 55% of people like another word or something. Yeah? But it's the most common method of reasoning, and I generally find that anyone that isn't like a Vygotskist or Marxist or some way already involved in a different kind of science will absolutely refuse to budge from the idea that concepts are collections of attributes. If you have a concept of something, then that means it's grey, big, and got a trunk. And I have a concept of an elephant. This is actually Dickens as a what's that book with Mr. Chopin or something or other. Dickens does a wonderful parody on that, where kids are asked by the teacher, define a horse.
Mr. Gradgrind.
Yeah, that's right, Mr. Gradgrind. There's two obscure questions that come after the answer. I should have you in every audience, actually. But, okay, what you do, you assume that there's something, right? And then it has various attributes, height, weight, colour, and so on. Okay? And then you take your concept of it by listing off the attributes. And I mean, contemporary American, cognitive psychology, which is producing reams and reams and reams of papers on the question of concept, are absolutely stuck on the idea that a concept is a list of the attributes of the applied to it. Right? If you have a concept of something, then you can list, the size, shape, colour, location of it. Now, this is so barren, so bankrupt that I'm able to lose it trying to express what I'm making. Okay, so we have, I'll get a lead archetype out of it, because it's basically unit, but 4 different ways of conceiving of a whole, right? Through its unit, microcosm, through common attributes. Like, what is a South African? Anyone that was born in South Africa? Oh no, not quite. Anyone that's living, anyone that's got a grandfather, right? This type of defining something by an attribute. Now, I might say to get away from that, the more sophisticated way, when you try and answer a question like, what is a South African? I mean, you can't just do it on the page. It takes years of study and deep study about how people work before you can come back and say, well, South Africans are whatever. Right? And of course, you may never find someone who can totally fix that. But if you want to understand a complex process, you have to sort of get the concept of it, what moves it, what it's about. And you don't get that by taking a contingent attribute. You see, the people who go in the attributes, there's actually nothing, the attributes are hanging on nothing. And in fact, in certain currents of political theory, it's outrageous to suggest that there's anything under the attributes. It's essentialism, which regarded as reactionary. Okay? But in fact, what you're talking about there is gaining a concept of something. And when you have a concept of it, the way that concept is realised may be very diverse and even contradictory to the concept of it. Science begins with getting a concept of the subject matter. So, what's next? Okay. So I'm going to sort of quite quickly move on into Vygotsky's a number of concepts that Vygotsky had to deal with the science of consciousness. First thing I have to mention that, as indicated by a little quote from Marx, consciousness isn't just a one thing. There's just one process, or which you could say this is what consciousness is. And Vygotsky's most famous work, called Thinking and Speech, just focuses on verbal thinking, the connection between speaking and thinking. And by taking word meaning, what you mean by a word, and word meaning is an act. It's not something like what it says in the dictionary about the word. Word meaning is an act. Like if I say something to Rashad here, my words, I give those words meaning in a specific context in relation to another person. That's what word meaning is. It's not what you find in the dictionary of the word. It's an act of using a word to, in relation, yes,
Is that very close to Wittgenstein?
No, I don't think so. I found it quite difficult to draw the line between Wittgenstein and Vygotsky. A lot of people actually, a lot of people like both and put them together. But I want to say, Vygotsky is much deeper, because it's kind of a theory of psychology. This is I did this picture last night to indicate Vygotsky's idea of thinking and speech. Now, I don't think, and it's funny enough, I accidentally left the little twisted lines in the middle, which I did with a pencil on Carol's photocopier. And when she saw it in the morning, she knew exactly what it was. It was about word meaning, which I was really chuffed with, because obviously we've got the idea. So, firstly, Vygotsky deals with the thought and speech as developing processes, essentially processes of development. Essentially. So when he has to answer the question of the relation between speaking and thinking, the infant, they're two separate functions that have quite separate conditions for their existence, that are directed in part of different functions of the life of an infant, and they don't interconnect to each other at all. A child uses speech to gain the attention of an adult, with no intellectual content at all, and their thinking develops through practical engagement with things with no help from words at all. So you have two separate lines of development, but at a certain point they meet and they intertwine with each other, and both speech and thinking go through a series of stages. I mean, I'm really abbreviating, but in Vygotsky's work there's about 10 stages in there. And many other. I'm not a psychologist, Carol or someone like you just thought, but that conception, I don't see that in Wittgenstein at all. But at a certain level, in counter to, they would be in alliance against certain other conceptions, put it that way. But I think they are different conceptions. And you see, in inner speech, Vygotsky, how can you study inner speech? Surely introspection. But he devised a way. He observed children as they were beginning to lose their egocentric speaking aloud, and you could sort of almost see the speech going inward. And as they vocalised less and less, their vocalisations took on a very characteristic form. They dropped the subject from sentences. Instead of give me, it would just be give. We don't know what this subject is, but you know what I mean. The subjects of sentences would drop because they knew what the subject was. They just needed the predicate. And it gets terribly abbreviated, so you can watch the development of a specific kind of speech, which was inner speech, which is part of the development of thought, because children use speech as a tool to aid things doing, like they'll give themselves commands. Now I need to do this, and then I should put that there, and then Daddy will give me a snack, or whatever. They learn to do that much more quickly and efficiently, while not actually vocalising, not because they're keeping it secret. They just don't need to. They don't need all that effort. So they're quick because the speech changes its form. It isn't necessary to communicate to another person, and they can control their own behaviour with speech which has become more and more abbreviated. And in just the last pages of the book, we talked about thinking which goes beyond words. That is to say, you have thought going on that is not at all verbal. But like when I'm putting a talk together or something, I get to a certain point, I can't go any further, I happily go to bed. Wake up in the morning, and on we go. Because half the problems will be solved. Right? We all have I think it's right to say that non-verbal thought is also subconscious, but it's still thought. And the disagreement Vygotsky has with Freud about the subconscious is that the subconscious, in Vygotski's here, is like the final ultimate product of the development of the mind. When you don't need words and you don't have to vocalise things, you can think without being conscious of it. Whereas Freud, of course, thinks it's one terrible legacy that you're born with. Okay. Yeah, that's good enough for an example. Thank you.
Can you go back to the slide where you had this verbal thinking, just so that you see
the previous one?
Yeah, that.
Yeah, I didn't get to this one down here, periods of Dania. Because this is just to make, I'll bring this up to make one point. There is a widespread misconception that Vygotsky is somehow focused on words. He was into language, and Vygotsky is all about speech and things. It's really based on the fact that one book that's most well known is about speech. You've got other books, about child development, for instance, which has sort of 50 pages before you get to speech. And he wrote a huge volume like this thick on the emotions. Right? Vygotsky was interested in all aspects of the mind. So the unit that he used for the development of personality was Perezhevania. It's a Russian word for which there's no English equivalent, but I think the nearest English equivalent is adventure, and the German is Erlebnis, which means translated into English as lived experience. So subject and objective in the sense that the adventure happens to, it's objective, it's real, but it's what it does to you and the way it changes you. And I understand that he uses the idea of catharsis as a reflection on Perezhevania,